Andrea Knabel knew what it meant when someone disappeared. She had been volunteering with missing person searches. She understood the urgency, the flyers, the tips, the endless waiting. But then, in the early morning hours of August 13th, 2019, Andrea became the person everyone was searching for. In this episode, we're going to walk through who Andrea was, the strange sequence of events on her final night, the timeline of her disappearance, and the search that has continued for nearly 7 years. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Miles Reef. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Sean, what are we getting into today?
We've got a really interesting case today, Miles. So this is the Andrea Knabel disappearance case from 2019. Andrea was a 37-year-old woman who disappeared in a suburb of Louisville, Kentucky called Audubon Park. This is a safe neighborhood. She had multiple family members living in this neighborhood, including her mother and her sister, who lived a walking distance apart from each other. And at the time Andrea disappeared, she was staying at her mother's house. So the way that this whole thing unfolds is a little complicated, and we're going to take you through it in detail shortly. But what's interesting to know, like the core mystery here is Andrea was walking in a place that was familiar to her between family members' homes. For some reason, she could not find a place to stay that night. There's details there you're about to hear. But at the end of this night, Andrea, who herself was an advocate for missing people and involved in organizations trying to find missing people, herself disappeared. Her credit cards were never found or used. Her phone has never been found or used again. It's as though she vanished into thin air. But in order to understand who Andrea was and what was really going on that night, I think the best place to start is to back up and sort of introduce her as a person, and we can move forward from there and get into the details.
So Andrea was 37 years old at the time of her disappearance in 2019. She was a mother of two. She had two sons, and she was living in the Louisville, Kentucky area. But she did disappear in the Audubon Park, Fincastle Road area, as Sean already mentioned. Now, according to her family, Andrea's been described as energetic, funny, outspoken. She was deeply involved with the people around her. And she had become part of this missing persons advocacy group, which is, very interesting considering that, she's now the subject of a missing persons case. She had been involved in on-the-ground searches. She was doing advocacy work with some of the families of these missing people. So it was something that she had a real passion for and that she'd become deeply involved with. The group that she was working with was called Missing in America. Her family has told us, and they have mentioned publicly before, that they don't believe that her missing person advocacy group actually had anything to do with her disappearance. But it is a very interesting fact that a person who was so involved in missing persons advocacy ultimately became the subject of a missing persons case themselves. So I think it may not have anything to do with why Andrea disappeared, but to understand where she was at in her life and the context of what was going on that night when she did disappear, we have to have a little bit of background of where she was as a person and where her life was at that moment. So during this time period of financial hardship, Andrea was living with her mother. Now, at the same time, Andrea's mother house was undergoing serious renovations. Now, it just so happens that the people that were doing the renovations on the house were Andrea's sister Sarah and her boyfriend Ethan. Ethan was a contractor. He did this for a living. So they were actually doing the work on Andrea's mother's house. So they were actually staying at the home. Andrea's mother was not staying there because the bathrooms weren't necessarily functioning up to speed, and there was just a lot of chaos in the house because it was getting redone. So she wasn't staying there the night that Andrea actually went missing. But Andrea's sister Sarah and her boyfriend Ethan were staying there because they were working on the home. Now, I think it's just important to say that Andrea was in a vulnerable transition period at this time. Doesn't explain her disappearance, and we're not saying that this in any way makes her responsible for what happened to her, but it may explain in some way why the night unfolded in a rather unusual way. And I think a lot of you guys were familiar with the case. You've probably dived into it on Reddit and other places online. And there is a lot of speculation around what may or may not have been going on in Andrea's life and, what state of mind she was in and who she might have been mixed up with. So I think it's important that we do acknowledge that she was in a bit of a transitional stage, you could say. She wasn't having the easiest time of it. She was 37 years old. She was living in her mother's house, so just to give it some context.
Absolutely. And I think what's important here too, just looking at what's publicly available out there and what the family has come forth and said in the past, is that a lot of people look at this story and say it seems like maybe Andrea was on drugs. The family has never officially said that they believe that. They are open to the fact that it's a possibility. They've told us and other, media outlets things like her life had taken a turn. She had recently lost her job that she had had for many years. Her behavior had changed. There were sort of like irritations on her skin that were unusual. A lot of things that to an outside observer might look like either the oncoming of a mental health crisis or a substance abuse issue, or possibly both, maybe one causing the other. These things often go hand in hand. What we don't know for sure is that any of that was the case, but it certainly does look like some of that stuff may be involved. And I think it's important to set that context up front because now we're going to walk through the timeline of what happened with Andrea that night that we can confirm, and especially between her and her various family members, that will give you a little context as to why people maybe behaved the way that they did or some of these interactions went the way that they went. So, Andrea's staying at her mother's house, like Miles said, because her life is in this transitional period, because she has lost a job. She's trying to get back on her feet. There may or may not be other things operating in the background, making this difficult. But basically, that night, Andrea has dinner with her sister Sarah, her husband Ethan, and her mother, who is at the house for this meal. During that conversation, it's raised by the mother that Andrea could probably be doing more to get herself out of the house and back on her own 2 feet. Obviously, being 37 years old and living at home with her two kids is a sort of a stressful situation for everybody. Then you add this remodel into it, and you could see that maybe nerves were a little frayed at that point with this family. Andrea doesn't like this. She gets really upset. She goes upstairs. So then basically, this dinner is broken up. Around 9 p.m., Andrea's mother leaves the house. She's going to go stay at one of her friends' homes that night. Andrea later comes back down and re-engages with her sister Sarah and Sarah's husband Ethan. She wants to go to McDonald's, and then ultimately she wants to go to the ER for a rash or some sort of an infection on her face, like we talked about. So we do know that Ethan agrees to drive her. It's just a little bit before 10 p.m. when he drops her off at the emergency room. Then he goes home. The plan at this point is for Andrea to probably call a rideshare service to get back from the hospital since she did not take her own car. And she does indeed do that. At 11:30 p.m., Andrea takes a lift back to her mother's house. But when she gets there, this is where things start to get weird. She can't get inside the home because the door is locked, even though Ethan and Sarah are there and we're supposed to be there. No one's answering the door. She can't get in. So Andrea gets a little frustrated and she decides to walk to her sister Erin's house, which was nearby, just a few minutes away, in a sort of adjacent neighborhood. She's made this walk many times, and even though it's late at night, Audubon Park is considered to be a pretty safe suburban neighborhood, and she's familiar with it. So she takes this late night walk. And indeed, she does arrive at Erin's house at midnight, 12 a.m. They talk for a little while. Erin actually has a friend with her over at that point. And so the friend is kind of there with them. They chat. And then ultimately, an hour later at 1 a.m., Erin drives Andrea back to the other house to try to stay. Now, it's important to remember that Erin has told us that basically her house was also having some renovation. It's also just not set up for a guest. She had kids of her own there. There was no real room for Andrea to sleep because I think from this point you would just say, why didn't Andrea sleep there if she couldn't get into the other house? There was a reason. So the sisters decided we're going to take her back to the first house, to mom's house, to see if someone will answer the door, if we can get you, somewhere to stay. But what's interesting that happens here is Erin drops off Andrea and then heads back to her own house before really finding out what goes on with Andrea because her friend is still watching the kids and she just wants to get home and back to her kids and make sure everything's okay there. Now, this is in hindsight, an interesting point of this whole story because what actually happens with Andrea is she still can't get in the home, but now Erin is gone. So yet again, Andrea is in this situation where she's on the street in front of a house. No one's around, no one's answering the door. So this is where we sort of start to lose track of what really happens to Andrea. Later on, we will find out that she made several phone calls to friends, including using like a Facebook call sort of system to some friends, even including people from the Missing in America network who she was close to. But because it's kind of really late at night at this point, it's after 1 in the morning, no one's picking up. She can't get in touch with anybody. So, with nobody picking up, Andrea decides to walk back to Aaron's house. I hope you guys aren't confused. There is a ping ponging back and forth. She's walking back and forth between these two homes basically all night. She goes back to Aaron's house one more time and complains that the door at the mother's house is still locked and that nobody's answering it. She speaks with Aaron for a couple minutes. She's starting to get really frustrated and upset. And of course, Aaron can't do much. There's nowhere for Andrea to stay at this house. And so Andrea, after staying for a couple minutes, decides to walk back again and she walks out into the night. So this will really be the last time that Aaron ever sees Andrea. Andrea walks out into the night, basically saying, "I'm going to figure it out." We know that she calls a couple more people, but that nobody really, that we can tell, picks up. And later on, data from her Google account, not her actual phone, because that was never recovered, but her Google account showed that she, with that phone, made it back to her mother's house. And that is the last data point we have as far as her location goes. So, did somebody eventually come to get Andrea that she had contacted? Did she meet some stranger along the way who maybe offered to help? Or did she go somewhere on her own? And we still haven't figured out where that is. We really don't know. All we know is that after this, Andrea was never seen again. So she's out there in the middle of the night looking for a place to stay and sort of poof into thin air, right, Miles?
Yeah. No, I think there's a couple of things that I just want to make clear. Andrea's phone has never been found. As far as what we know, as far as what the authorities have told us, her credit cards and her debit card have never been used since her disappearance. The police do have her laptop. They did get access to her social media accounts. They did search her mother's property and they interviewed all the family members, including Sarah and Ethan. Now, I think, you know, we need to just kind of like break down what makes this case so strange, right? Like what's so interesting about this night? And I think what everyone usually focuses on is this repeated back and forth that, that Andrea was taking part in, right? That she was going between these two homes and, seemingly not able to find a place to stay and just bouncing back and forth between these two places, right? Either not able to gain access or not able to stay. And I think that that's led to a lot of speculation about the family and the people who were staying there and who may or may have not been around and what their possible involvement may have been in Andrea's disappearance. Right now, what we know is that she was moving between her mother's house and her sister Erin's house, and then she possibly went back to the mother's house again. And what we do know is that that creates a very, very localized zone of where Andrea was and where she disappeared in, right? Because we do know that she was seen going back and forth between these two homes. So the locked door at the mother's house is one of the key recurring details that's always brought up about this case because Andrea reportedly returned to Erin's house because she could not get into the mother's house, right? So the question comes up, why was the door locked? Was there someone inside the home that knew she was trying to get in? Did she make it back inside? Did she get on the property? And her Google data did place her back at the mother's house. So what did that really mean, right? Because that's all we know is that what we have from that Google dashboard, right? So between 1:30 and 2 a.m., there has been reports from other people who said that they did get phone calls from Andrea trying to get a ride. So this is after she couldn't get access to her mother's house. She had gone back to her sister's house, and then she was trying to find someone else to pick her up. Now, who did she call? We do not know. What we do know is that between 1:30 and 2 a.m., apparently Andrea was calling people trying to get a ride. Now, we do know that one person who worked with her at that volunteer organization, Missing in America, said that they did get a call from Andrea, but she was asleep, and that there was a missed call from Andrea looking for a ride that night. As far as the rest of who else she may have called, if she actually talked to somebody, if somebody did volunteer to come and pick her up, we don't know. We do know that the police have the phone records. What they're doing with that, there's no way to know, but they haven't released any of this information publicly. So we do not know who she may have spoken to and if somebody actually agreed to come and pick her up. So potentially the phone data and the missing phone itself is probably the most important thing in this case, because obviously if there was access to that, a lot of answers would be found as far as who, if anyone, she may have had contact with that night. Because as far as we know, the last person that she got contact with was her sister when she's left her house going back to the mom's house. So the last time that Andrea is officially seen, as Sean had said, was in Audubon Park neighborhood on August 13th. The last time the family says they had contact with her is at 1:38 a.m. when Andrea left Aaron's house saying that she was going to walk back to her mother's house. So there's two ways to think about Andrea's last known moments, right? The official statement from the authorities is that she was last seen in Audubon Park August 13th. The family actually says that it was after 1:38 a.m. and it was at Erin's home where she was leaving to go to her mother's house. So no matter what, we know the general area that she was in, and we know that she was kind of bouncing back and forth between these two homes, right? That's what we do know. So, Sean, why don't we get into what the search has shown and what the investigation since her disappearance has given us?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, obviously the next step here is the next day when Andrea is nowhere to be found and all members of the family can't locate her. None of her friends know where she is. The police are brought in, right? Because this is officially a missing persons case and everybody is concerned for her. So an investigation is launched and shockingly little is found, which is why we're here talking about it as an unsolved case even today. Let's go to the first obvious steps, right? So we know that Andrea was staying at the mother's house. So was Sarah, her sister, and Sarah's husband, Ethan. We know that there had been some sort of a disagreement that night between the mother and Andrea and Sarah and Ethan. And we know that for some reason, even though they knew that Andrea was due to come back that night, nobody was either home or opened the door. Well, that's sorted out pretty quickly because the police interview Ethan and Sarah, who were the only two people that would have been there, and they said yes, they were in the house. Their first version of the story is that we were sleeping. We didn't hear her come back. We didn't know she came back. We assumed that maybe after the hospital she went and saw friends or did something else. Like we just went to bed. But that story evolves later as the police continue to bring them back in for multiple rounds of interviews, and eventually Ethan says, yes, okay, we did hear her come to the door at one point and she was knocking, but she was being really kind of erratic in her behavior outside. And we were scared. We were scared of her. I didn't want to open the door. So we just kind of let her, do her thing and then go away. This sort of is trying to tie back into, one would presume, the argument that they had earlier that Andrea was still mad, that you're trying to now picture sort of like a domestic situation where someone's screaming and banging on a door. The people inside don't want to open up to escalate it. But then it begs the question, like, even if that's plausible, why wasn't that the first version of the story? So this is something that people, who have looked into this case in the public eye, the family members, everybody has noticed this and talked about it as being a very strange evolution from we never heard Andrea come to the door to yes, okay, we heard her and we just didn't answer because she was acting erratically. We still don't know what to make of that. Stories evolve. It's usually not a good thing, but sometimes it happens. So I'm actually curious to see what our viewers think of that whole thing. But the fact of the matter is, as shady as that may seem to some people, the house was searched. The police got in there with search warrants. They looked around, and nothing was really found. And if anything was found, it certainly has been made public because it seems like they went and looked, and everything looked like Andrea had never entered that home. So, also, investigators were able to get a hold of Andrea's laptop. They were able to get into her social media accounts. And although it looked like, her life was complicated, and much as the family tells us in their interviews that you guys will see, she was hanging out with some less than desirable crowds of people, people who were involved with using drugs, maybe selling drugs. There wasn't a clear, caught red-handed indicator of anybody who could have done this to her. In other words, there wasn't like a last message of like, come here, do this, I'm gonna get you. Nothing like that. So a lot of smoke, but still no fire, right? If that makes sense. Um, Concurrently to the official law enforcement investigation, Andrea's family, particularly her sister Erin and her father Michael, really took up the banner in searching for her. There's a lot, especially to Michael's story, that we're going to let you guys see in his interview, which is coming next Friday, about just how far these two went in searching for Andrea. It's a lot. It almost feels like a movie, Miles and I felt like after we listened to the whole story. So I'll save the details for then. But suffice to say, The family was right on top of this from the get-go. And shockingly and sadly, it still hasn't really led anywhere. There's been tips, there's been, moments where information came in that sounded credible, but nothing has really materialized up to today to really point in the direction of where Andrea could be or what might have happened to her. So obviously, there are tip lines, right? There's currently a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in Andrea's case if it was indeed foul play. And we're going to put all the information you need if you have information or a tip for authorities down in the description and as usual at the end of the episode as well. Um, Miles, why don't we talk a little bit about what the leading sort of theories are here? Because it's been a couple years and a lot has been postulated about what could have happened to Andrea. You want to go through it?
Absolutely. And yeah, absolutely. And I think just before we get into the theories, I think it's important to add to what you were saying about Andrea's dad and his and her sister that, the search that they've continued to do and all the work that they did for many years after her disappearance. This is one of those sad cases because, you see when you do the kind of work that Sean and I do, you see different effects that these kinds of events can have on families. And there's not that much variation. So I feel like there's two main things that happen. A family bonds and becomes close because of this event, and they sort of like use this as a rallying point, and usually start getting involved in activism and advocacy, and they either start a nonprofit or they join other groups or they become victims advocates or they start working with victims advocacy groups. We've seen it over and over again in our careers. The other thing that sometimes happens is that families fracture, and they get hurt by these kinds of events. And unfortunately, it seems like from having spoken to the members of this family, that's kind of happened here, and there has been a bit of a separation or a rift in this family because of Andrea's disappearance, and because of who knows, you only know if you're involved and you're part of that group of why this could happen and what causes it. But the stress, as you can imagine, and the just feelings of helplessness and pressure obviously can lead to all kinds of arguments and conflicts that might not even be correct. And so that's, I think it's important to mention that because it's something that we do see, and it is rather sad, and it's you know I think it's just worth mentioning. So getting to the theories, right? So what could have happened to Andrea, right? I don't think the list is really long. I don't. I think there's always this speculation that Andrea decided to disappear, right? You hear that with so many people who go missing. There's, well, they just decided to start a new life, and they went off grid. But often when you hear that, it's about a person that probably never had like the either mental or financial capacity to do that. And I think that's the case with Andrea. I think, Andrea was in a place in her life where she was living with her mother. She was 37 years old. She was suffering a financial crisis. She was, from all accounts from her family, she was suffering maybe a mental health crisis. Her just like deciding to go start a new life somewhere just seems, a little bit, it just seems highly unlikely to me that that could have happened. Also, there's been no digital activity from her. No sightings have emerged. There is this nonprofit group that she was involved in that's been keeping an eye out for her, that has people out there working. Her father's been working, her sister's been working. So nothing's ever been seen, and it's not like this is a person who just like went missing and everyone was ignoring it, right? I guess what I'm saying is that there has been an active effort to try to find her. So the idea that she, somehow, despite having no financial means and being in the midst of what was probably a mental health crisis and perhaps drug problem, just decided to go off somewhere else and start a new life, seems highly unlikely and, improbable.
I agree. I agree. I'm not a fan of that theory in this particular case. But what about the idea of a mental health or maybe even a drug related crisis being a theory in and of itself?
I think that's much more valid. I think there's more chance of that being true, but then you get to the point of, well, then where did she go, right? Because someone suffering a drug crisis or a mental health crisis, that's not the same as someone with a plan who's, got a new passport and they're going to disappear and go off grid or whatever. That's someone who's got some issues and is, doing things that are putting themselves in harm's way. So if she ended up in a bad place, like, where's her body, right? Like where's the trail of anything actually happening? How come her phone has just like it's gone, right? Like, if you're someone who's in a drug crisis, you're trying to get drugs, right? You're trying to feed that itch. So how are you doing that? How are you communicating with people? It just seems, without any digital footprint, or just, sort of like disappearing literally, like both herself and her digital footprint, her phone. There's no pings, there's no nothing. It just seems unlikely that would be the case if it was a drug thing or a mental health thing. I feel like there would be some trace of her, right? Like she would have
Mhm.
shown up, whether that might have been days or weeks or months or maybe even years. But usually when someone gets into that life, they're not able to hide necessarily, right? Because they don't have their
Yeah,
wits about them, and they're operating on a sort of like, of fulfilling needs. So
right.
you're not being careful, I guess is what I'm saying. And when you have people actively searching for you and you're not being careful, the odds of you being found go up.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people who are suffering a mental health crisis or a drug-related sort of, crisis will disappear for a couple days. But like you said, usually they'll be spotted at some point. They'll turn up across town. If someone will see them at a freeway off-ramp or in a park, they'll turn up at a shelter or a hospital. You know what I mean? Like it seems very hard to imagine Andrea would sort of accidentally wander off that night and no one would have ever found a trace of her again, and that her phone, like you said, is off. None of her, bank accounts or credit cards were used. I mean, if she really did wander off in some sort of a crazed state, wouldn't she at least have wanted to buy a water bottle at some point, or something like that along the way? But that never happened. So that leads us into the next kind of darker theories, right? Which is that maybe this wasn't an accident and maybe she didn't wander off on purpose, but maybe somebody else was involved. Talk to
Right.
me,
Yeah.
Miles. What do you think?
Well, look, not knowing who she was reaching out to that night, not knowing who she may have gotten in touch with, and not knowing who may have or may not have picked her up, it's really, really hard to know. But obviously, that is something that's in play here, right? Did Andrea call someone? They came and got her, and that led to something really bad happening. Did she reach out to someone who was in this world that she had been dabbling in, according to her family, where she was using drugs, and she ended up somewhere, and either something bad happened to her, or she accidentally overdosed, and then people freaked out and disposed of her body. I think all of that is a possibility, and honestly I think it's much more likely than her disappearing voluntarily off, to start a new life, or her having some sort of mental health or drug crisis and just literally disappearing but still being out there. I think the chances that she got in touch with the wrong people and ended up in the wrong place, and the wrong thing happened is probably more likely. From speaking to her dad, the idea that she got picked up randomly in this area, it seems unlikely because it was a decent area where her mother and her sister lived. And I know we have certain viewers who get upset with the way that I describe neighborhoods, and I want to be what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to be disparaging or prejudiced in the way I'm using words, so I hope I'm saying this the right way, but it was a low crime area where she disappeared. So the likelihood of her just getting, picked up off the street and kidnapped, it's a low chance. Now, her father did give us some interesting information. He does have his own, thoughts around this, and the possibilities of it. And I want you guys to watch his interview to see what he has to say about it, because there is an interesting little theory that maybe ties into Andrea's disappearance. But again, I'm not saying that her dad even believes this, but it is something that he put out there during the interview, and I'm going to leave it for him to tell you about that. And I want you to watch that interview anyway, because he's an incredible guy, and what he's done in this case is incredible, and I think it's worth watching. So the only other thing that I can think of, and Sean, you know please jump in and add to this if you think there's something beyond these sort of four options. But the last thing that could have happened is that something happened to Andrea near her mother's house, right? Because the
Mhm.
last thing that we know is that she left her sister's place and she was headed back to her mother's place, right? I mean, that's, the information that we've gotten from the family themselves. So I'm not saying that that means that anyone at the house did something, but it does seem that from the Google dashboard data that we did see her getting back near the mother's house. And we also know that the cops searched the property. We know that they interviewed Sarah. We know that they interviewed Ethan. Neither of them have been charged with anything. Neither of them have been looked at as, under suspicion, as far as we know, by the authorities. I mean, this is 2019, so we're 7 years past, and nobody's been arrested. So but it's still, you have to wonder the proximity of where she was, that something happened around there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it is, it doesn't mean that she didn't get back to that location and eventually get a hold of maybe a friend or an acquaintance or somebody who agreed to pick her up at the house. So it could be that scenario we discussed earlier took place just closer in proximity to Andrea's mother's house than, rather in the middle of the neighborhood. But then you also have to go back and look at what a lot of people have brought up online, right? Questions about why did Ethan change his story about Andrea coming to the door? Why did he say they didn't hear her, but then later, after multiple rounds of interviews, how does that evolve into, yes, we heard her, we just decided to ignore her because we were afraid of her? People have also noted that, when it comes to media interviews, Ethan and Sarah don't do them. They have never really come and been public as in the way that Michael, the father, and Aaron, the other sister, have, as far as advocating for her to be found. When Michael and Aaron went out to do these searches, they weren't there. Shortly after this happened, they moved away to another part of Kentucky. We're back, and I say moved away. They actually lived in another part of Kentucky, but they left the mother's house and went back to where they were from. So that could all be totally legitimate. And like Miles said, they haven't been charged with anything, but it does raise questions that I feel like we would be remiss not to at least bring up as we're going through everything that people talk about when they talk about the Andrea Knabel case. We asked both Aaron and Michael about this little schism in their family, and what people think about this. And you will see their response in their interviews. It was very interesting to see where everybody's at with it and how the family has sort of coped with this very different um, situation, I guess you could call it, where do these two actually know more about Andrea's, whereabouts that night than they've come forth with, or are they as in the dark as the rest of us and are just handling it in a different way? We
Right.
don't know, and it's important to sort of try to be fair and measured and not, cast doubt and guilt on people who haven't been charged with anything. But, like I said, it would be wrong of us not to lay all the information out there as we explore what is known about that night and Andrea's last interactions with other human beings and her final location. A lot of it does come back to that house and who was at that house, and why the stories changed and why wasn't she let in. If indeed they are telling the truth and that they heard her and were just too scared to let her in, then we just wonder what happened after that to Andrea. Did she walk off somewhere else and run into trouble down the road? Did trouble find her in front of that home? And if so, what kind? This is basically where the case sits today. I mean, we really have not moved past that as far as answers about her whereabouts. There's no digital footprint of her leaving that home again. She doesn't go back to Aaron's. She's not seen in a McDonald's or a gas station up the street. That's it. After that, she's gone. So, Miles, I mean, what do we make of this from here? You've kind of heard the theories. Is there anything else we're missing?
Well, I would just add to what you were saying about Sarah and Ethan and what may or may not have happened that night, that it's very likely that their response has been out of guilt because they didn't answer the door, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this person that you've been dealing with, that perhaps was a bit volatile, that perhaps was having their own issues, and you're like, hey, you know what? We're just not going to answer the door, and then they go missing and you never see them again. That could create a real problem, emotionally and mentally. And you could start feeling guilty and, like, being worried when the cops show up, and changing what you're saying, and not even realizing that you're sort of bringing suspicion on yourself because you're just operating from a place of guilt and fear. and
Maybe
that
they
could
were
also,
embarrassed to admit that they didn't open the door, like you
well,
said. I
that's
mean,
what I'm
it
saying. And it
doesn't
can
make them
also,
look good.
that can fracture a family, because of the guilt, and that can make you look guilty to the outside world. So what I'm saying is we've covered a lot of cases in our careers, and sometimes what looks like one thing is that thing. Quite often, when it looks like something, it is that thing. But sometimes it's not. And sometimes there's extenuating circumstances. And sometimes human nature is a weird, weird thing that operates in weird ways. And so I just want to throw that out there that, like, I know what these comments are going to say, and I love you guys, and we're going to get into it. We're going to chop it up with you in the comments, and we're going to do a comment react. But I just want to be clear that, like, we should try and have some grace and understand that, like, if you had some issues with your friend or your sibling because they were having a drug problem and they were banging on your door at 1:30 in the morning, and you were like, you know what, let's just let them deal with it themselves this time, and then they
Hmm.
disappeared for the rest of their lives, well, for the next 6 7 years, you might feel really, really weird about that, and it could really do some things to your head. So that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and
uh,
then you can also you just to kind of extrapolate on what you're saying, you could also see why that being the situation, people would be reluctant to speak to the media, where they're that's going to be scrutinized to hell and back. They're going to be under a spotlight, quizzed about why did you do that? Why did you do that? You could see why maybe somebody would choose not to put themselves in that position, even if they legitimately had nothing to do with the disappearance and were as concerned as everyone else about that person. So Miles and I don't pretend to have ESP, right, and know what goes on in everyone's brain when we talk about these stories. All we can do is kind of describe what everyone sees from the outside and try to be as fair about that as possible, right? It's fair to bring it up, but also we should all be fair when examining it and trying to make sense of it, right? Because we actually don't really know what the story is here, beyond the facts that we have in front of us.
There is one more theory that we should touch on, and I know I said there's only like four possibilities that I can see, but we do know from sources at the organization that Andrew was working with that there was a very, very dangerous, sort of sticky missing persons case that most of the group had decided was too dangerous to be involved with, that Andrew was actually looking into and trying to work on. And there is some speculation around this that maybe she had gotten somewhere with it, and maybe it had kind of like come back to her, and maybe that's tied into her disappearance.
Yeah, it's hard to say because there's no direct evidence of her actually, working on this, sort of going rogue on her own. There's a lot of talk about it on Reddit and the usual places where people discuss these cases, where it's been raised multiple times as a possibility. Did she try to go undercover? Is this case related to like organized crime or something like that? And she got too close. These are all interesting theories, obviously, but there's no real material evidence to back it up. It's just sort of something that has arisen in the background of Andrea's story, given the group she was involved in and the very, very strange, disappearance that happened to her. So it could very well be that that is the case, but I'd be a little surprised. That feels more Hollywoodish, I guess, than some of these other things we've discussed.
I think that's right. I mean, look, here's what we know. Andrea disappeared within a small window of time in a small, location. If we gridded it out, it was a pretty small spot, while trying to get back inside a house where she had been staying, right? Her phone's gone, her cards have not been used, and it's 7 years later almost, and her family's still searching. And, that's what we know, right? So if you know anything about Andrea's disappearance, please, please, please contact the Louisville Metro Police or call the family tip line. We'll put them both up at the end of this. Even something that could seem meaningless, 6 7 years ago, could matter now. So, if so, you heard something, someone said something to you, maybe you saw something weird that night that maybe it wasn't Andrea, but something else. Anything could help at this point. So I think if you've been sitting on something or if you've heard something, it's worth reaching out, because that's the only thing that's going to crack this at this point. Guys, let us know what you think. Obviously, we're going to be posting some interviews about this case, but why don't you let us know in the comments what you think may have happened to Andrea? I have a feeling I know what some of you are going to say, but I am curious to get the larger groups weigh in on this one, because it is another one of these just very, very mysterious, just into thin air, no trace disappearance cases. And as I've said before, the more that we do these, the more I'm blown away by just how many people have disappeared in the United States without any trace, and normal people living normal lives with families, et cetera, et cetera. We're not talking about, transients or, I guess, and you could say Andrew is perhaps involved in some dangerous behavior, but still, it's an odd disappearance. So yeah, we're very, very curious to know what you guys all think. Remember, we are an audio podcast. You can find us anywhere where you get your audio podcast. That's going to be Apple, that's going to be Spotify, Amazon Music. As always, guys, if you like what we're doing, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video, hit the notifications bell. It really helps us in the algorithm. It helps to platform these cases, get them across to more people. And if you really like what we're doing, share it, drop us a comment. And we do have the membership area. If you really, really, really like what we're doing and you want to help us keep doing it, subscribe. It's not that much money. You get early access to all of our vids, and we do have some more membership benefits coming up soon. So yeah, stay tuned, and please check out the subsequent interviews in this case, because I think you guys will be really, really, I think you guys will be really, really interested in what Andrea's father has to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, guys, and we will see you in the comments.